Senator is not in a quorum call.
Thank you, Mr.
Senator
President.
is recognized.
Mr. President, we've begun the long-awaited process of moving forward on legislation that will bolster our domestic semiconductor manufacturing and confront the growing threats posed by China. This legislation's had many different names over the last year or so. We started with the Endless Frontier Act in the Senate. Then miraculously it became the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, affectionately known as USICA. And then it became the Make It in America Act, but now it's got a new name, the Bipartisan Innovation Act. Well, regardless of what you call it, it's absolutely critical that we get a strong version of this legislation to the President's desk as soon as we can. The Senate passed the original legislation last summer with significant bipartisan support. We urged our colleagues in the House to treat this legislation with a sense of urgency that it deserved, but they wasted months with no action. To be charitable, I guess they were preoccupied with other matters. But it wasn't until last month that, just ahead of the President's State of the Union, when they finally leapt into action. The President, of course, wanted to talk about this legislation in his speech, so House Democrats had to cobble together a bill in short order. Unfortunately, it was a highly partisan one. Their bill passed almost entirely along party lines, and now the two chambers, the House and the Senate, have a critical task ahead of us to reconcile those two versions. We need to begin the formal conference committee process, dive into negotiations, and get that strong bill to the President's desk. The cornerstone of this effort, as far as I'm concerned, is bolstering our domestic semiconductor manufacturing. Even more concerning is that 92% of the world's most advanced semiconductors come from one place, and that is Asia. 63% come from Taiwan alone. If that supply chain were cut off, it would lead to very serious consequences. And unfortunately, that potential is not just a doomsday scenario that's far-fetched by any means. A few months ago, I led a congressional delegation to Asia to learn more about the need to confront China in a variety of ways in that region. One of the leaders we met with was the head of the Indo-Pacific Command, the regional command that covers that part of the globe, and he described the current power dynamic rather succinctly. He said it's not a question if China invades Taiwan, but when. Well, we have one rough idea when that could potentially happen. President Xi Jinping himself said he wants to be ready to unify the People's Republic of China with Taiwan by 2027, just 5 years from now. But the truth be told, we don't have any idea when President Xi will call that play. We won't have any more notice for that than we did for Putin invading Ukraine. It's tough to overestimate the impact this would have on the United States and our allies. And even absent some military action by the People's Republic of China seeking to swallow up and absorb Taiwan with its manufacturing capacity for these semiconductors, if we had another pandemic, if we had another natural disaster, any one of those three things could disrupt that critical supply chain, much to our detriment and that of the rest of the world. We learned one thing in COVID-19, and that is that these supply chains are very vulnerable. I still remember the first call I had with my governor when COVID broke out, and I said, well, what do you need? What can we do to help? And he said, I need two things. I need testing and I need PPE, personal protective equipment. Those are gowns and masks used by healthcare professionals and others to protect themselves when treating people with COVID-19. And the fact of the matter is, almost all of it is made in China. This notion of globalization of the economy has led us to believe that the only thing to think about when it comes to manufacturing a product is where can it be made the cheapest? But obviously there's more at stake than just who can make it the cheapest. We learned that in COVID-19, thus the need to bolster our critical supply chains across a whole range of products, including semiconductors. Well, semiconductors are something that most of us don't know a lot about. I've had to learn a lot myself about it, and I'm still don't consider myself an expert. But I asked my staff, I said, well, please, tell me how important is this? And they said, well, Senator, it's everything with an off and on switch involves semiconductors. And if you think about how technological our lives are and how much we depend on everything from the sensors in our car, the backup camera when we back our car out of a parking place, to the laptop computers that our kids were using during COVID-19 to study virtually. And then there's farming equipment, communications equipment, medical equipment. All of these rely on semiconductors, and 90% of them come from one region of the world, and that is Asia. The shortages we've experienced recently would seem insignificant compared to the complete chaos that would ensue if this supply chain was disrupted. This gets downright dangerous when you think about how a global chip shortage would impact our national security and, more broadly, global security. Russia's attack and invasion on Ukraine is a wake-up call for the United States and our allies to examine our defense posture across the planet. One of the bright spots of this, if you can call it that, is that countries in Europe, including countries like Germany that were reluctant to contribute 2% of their gross domestic product to the joint collective defense effort of NATO, has turned around and stepped up. That's a welcome development. But the fact of the matter is, our military and our national security depends on access to these semiconductors, because increasingly our military depends on technology to perform their mission. And one advantage that the United States has typically had against our adversaries around the world is our advanced technology and our capacity to innovate and to solve problems using that technology. But here's the bottom line. That technology cannot function without semiconductors. It's that simple. Whether you're talking about advanced fighters like the 5th generation fighter, the F-35, you're talking about missile defense systems like Iron Dome that was used by Israel to defeat the rockets that were raining in on it in recent months. A single interceptor used by the Iron Dome missile defense system, rocket defense system, contains more than 750 semiconductors, just a single one. So semiconductors are our key to confront threats by any adversary, not just China, and are essential to our economy here in the United States. Earlier this week, 2 national security and foreign policy experts at the University of Texas wrote an op-ed piece in the Hill magazine, our newspaper, and they made the national security case for CHIPS funding. They noted this is not the first time that semiconductor supply chains were regarded as a matter of national security. Back in the 1980s, President Reagan pushed to maintain our competitive edge in these chips, thereby helping us lead in the advanced weapons and aircraft that they enabled. As they said, Reagan didn't just outspin the Soviets, we also out-innovated the Soviets, winning that arms race. And that's what we need to do again today. We can't just rely on our ability to spend more than Russia or China or any other adversary. We need to out-innovate them as well. Considering the fact that China is the #1 master thief of intellectual property, it's all that much more important Now, some critics of the CHIPS program that's been introduced by the senator from Virginia, Senator Warner, and myself, both of us serve on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, is one reason why, because of the briefings we get, that this became a matter of grave concern to both of us. But the good news is that concern is shared by a broad bipartisan majority in the Senate. There are some, though, who said that this initiative is just a bailout for domestic energy. But, Madam President, that's not the case at all. This is not a handout. It's frankly one of the tools we have to reshore, to bring back onshore this essential manufacturing capacity, as well as incentivize domestic industry to build out our capacity here at home. Well, here are the numbers. Over the last 3 decades, the U.S. has gone from producing 37% of the global chip supply to just 12% today. 12% here in America, the rest of it in Asia and other places around the world. And that's a big flashing red light when it comes to our national security. Without some federal incentives, companies cannot afford to invest the enormous amount of time and capital needed to stand up new chip fabs or expand existing ones. And that's because it costs about 30% more to build these fabs here in America than it does overseas. But again, going to the low-cost producer is not the only consideration when it comes to these vulnerable supply chains that are so important to our economy and our national security. That's why it's absolutely critical for us to bring this semiconductor manufacturing back home, and full funding for the CHIPS program is the best way for us to see results. We began to establish this program more than a year ago in the National Defense Authorization Act, and the only thing missing now is, well, you guessed it, it's money. We need the appropriation in order to fund this CHIPS program that we began to embrace over a year ago in the National Defense Authorization Act. And that's why it's absolutely critical that we begin the conference committee process for the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, or whatever it's called today. I'll have to refresh my memory, the Bipartisan Innovation Act, since it's had so many different names. But we need to get this done, and we need to get this done now. And we need to get it done right. Now, I expect the final bipartisan conference committee report to look a whole lot like the Senate version. That's because, as I mentioned a moment ago, the House decided to take the low road and pass purely a partisan bill. The Senate bill was the product of intense bipartisan negotiations and represented a good faith compromise by all sides. I think that's the best place for us to begin once the formal conference committee process is underway. I hope we can work quickly to reach a final agreement, and one that will serve the interests of the American people, our economy, and most importantly, our national security. I urge all our colleagues to weigh into this process so we can begin that conference committee and reach a bipartisan resolution promptly. This is not a time for us to dawdle or to play politics. It's a time for us to get the strongest possible bill we can to the President's desk. And that begins with passing this appropriation portion of this bill to bring that manufacturing capacity back to America. Madam President, I yield the floor. And I'd note quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.